Okay, up to this point, I have been working very loose and sort of sloppy, and that was on purpose. It was a way for me to not worry about the details and just get the composition looking good. And at this point, I am happy with it. So what I'm going to do is enlarge the composition. I'm going to have just more pixels to work with, and then I'm going to start making my sort of final lines. Between the line work and setting up paths, what this phase does is give me a very sort of nice foundation on which to make my painting. You can think of everything I've done up to this point as sort of a blueprint that's really just going to be reference for me, but this is actually the painting. I'm now starting working on the final. And so generally this is when I get serious about perspective. So for me, the way I like to get my perspective correct is to use guides generated by a piece of software called Carapace. Now, this was made by the programmers over at Epic Software, and I think it only works for Windows, but this is just my personal preference. Now, it's also worth noting you can use the vanishing point tool inside of Photoshop, and you can set up planes in essentially the same way. But really, all we're getting here is a perspective grid. And once I have a grid, it's going to allow me to make my careful, finished line work with just a little more accuracy. And the nice thing about Carapace is once I've got my perspective points set in the proper spots, I just hit Control-C, copy, and then it gives me a 2D image that I can paste right into Photoshop. And it defaults to having sort of a white background, and I want the opposite, because all I want visible are these grid lines. So I invert that layer and then set it to something like linear dodge, which just means I'm going to have the lines visible and everything else hidden. And I'll sort of mask out what I don't need. And this will give me that nice roadmap. And for the rest of this process is really nothing all that special. Here you could be doing this on paper with, pencils and a ruler. I just happen to be doing it in Photoshop. And all I'm doing is clarifying. Because what I did in the process up to this point is thinking more in terms of tone and shape, sort of large-scale graphic composition. But ultimately, this is a scene. It is set in a particular place, and so the details matter. So now when I get my pencil out, or in this case, brush, I am actually deciding what are these objects. This would be a great time to start looking at specific photo reference for realistic details, and this is when you're just dressing out your scene. And as far as the technical side goes, I like to use a couple extra layers so I can control each line independently, and then when I like them, I'll flatten them down, because you really don't need more than one line art layer total. But for me, while I'm working, I just like to have what I call temp layers, just to kind of give me a little wiggle room. Now, another thing to notice here is I'm working at a very high zoom level. And what you're doing with zoom is you're sort of trading off the ability to be loose and flexible for the ability to be very, very specific and controlled. And it really, at this point in the process, I'm okay with being controlled. Because yes, you do give up a little bit of that dynamic quality, but the whole idea of working loose first is that I've kind of come up with my idea in a loose, dynamic way, and now I don't need to be dynamic anymore. Now I need to be clean and methodical. And with that in mind, zooming really far into my canvas and sort of getting tunnel vision is okay, because I've already made those sort of large-scale choices. Now I'm just doing cleanup. I'm sort of adding clarity at the small scale. And every artist treats line art differently. For me, line art does not need to look pretty. In fact, I very rarely even show my line drawing on the internet because I'm not a huge fan of mine. But for some artists, the pencil drawing is a thing of beauty. And for me, it doesn't need to be. I know that I'm going to paint over this entire thing, and you're not going to see any of these lines at the end of the day. So really all I'm doing is deciding where are my edges. Where does one object stop and the next one begin? Now for you, you might want to leave some of your line art in the final image, and in that case, the quality of the lines themselves is going to matter more. But for me, not such a big deal. This is just a blueprint that I'm going to completely erase by the end of the painting. And then once I'm totally done with the line art, the next part is just to give myself some paths. Now, if you don't use paths, I would recommend you consider it. This does use the pen tool. As you see here, I'm sort of tracing out vector shapes. But in series edge control, I talk a lot about why this is so powerful. But the short version is, if you make a path now that sort of outlines a important area in your composition, later down the road, you can hold down Control and click on the path, and you'll immediately have a selection. So when we are painting in the future and we want to, isolate one specific area of the canvas, this path palette becomes incredibly valuable. So really all I'm doing here is picking out the important shapes in my image, tracing them with vector shapes, and then, as you see, I'm building up a list of named path layers. And these live in their own palette, but it's important that they're named so later when I want to, find the character, I can quickly find his path, Control click on it, and then I have a selection. So it's one of those things where I'm spending maybe 45 minutes at the very beginning of the process, but it's going to save me a lot of time down the road. And for me, that is essentially a prepped canvas. I have nice line art on its own layer, and I also have a nice path palette that's all filled up with shapes that I'm able to reference later. At this point, I'm going to move on to the next phase, which is the blocking.